Let's talk about the negative traits in Project Zomboid Build 41. Unlike my positive trait video, this will not be a tier list, because there are very few limitations when it comes to picking them. You can pretty much take all of them if you want. Instead, I'll focus on the actual gameplay changes the traits force you into and whether you can play around them. Initially, I was going to try to keep this short, but it's impossible, so enjoy a lengthy ramble. You will not be missing anything if you only listen to this one as you do something else, so go ahead and start up a new Zomboid run or do your chores. Starting off, we have Sunday Driver. This is the ultimate newbie trap. As you can see from the tooltip here, which comes from the mod more description for traits, it decreases your acceleration and limits your max speed to 30 miles per hour. This trait will eventually kill you if you get in a bad situation with a car. The reduced acceleration makes towing very slow, and off-roading even worse. You can still do both of them, but when you add in a horde of zombies surrounding the car, that lack of torque means you're probably going to get stuck and have to bail, which usually leads to death. Also, even if you are willing to waste your time driving between towns at a crawl, the gas consumption speed is primarily based on the car being on. Sunday Driver wastes the most gas. Yes, even more than Speed Demon. For 1 point, it's just not worth it. It might even push you into the habit of never leaving your starting town, which is a terrible habit I see new players suffer through fairly often. What about all thumbs? This one is a little weird because there's some funny business going on with item transfer speeds that makes it not as terrible as it first seems, but when it hits hard. It's a trait I'd say is probably never worth it. In the best case scenario, all it does is waste your own time. In the worst case scenario, you fail to pick up a weapon in time and are forced to defend yourself via pushing. Clumsy. Oh, do I hate this trait. There's only one reliable source of stealth in the game, and that's sound-based stealth. This trait makes your footsteps louder, which will aggro zombies even above and below you when walking around in an apartment building, for example. It's not very fun dealing with homing beacon zombies from multiple floors at once. Then you have the increased trip chance, which makes it so you always have a chance to trip over short fences if you run to jump them. That doesn't mean this is a worthless trait. Both of these problems can be played around. Only pressing E to jump short fences takes longer and puts you at risk of being bitten as you climb it, but it also doesn't use any stamina, something you should get into the habit of doing when it's safe. The louder footsteps can be completely ignored if you're one of many players who constantly yell and slay all the zombies. You can't take a surprise bite to the back if they are all dead after all. At 2 points, it's worth it for some playstyles. Cowardly. This is one of those traits that gets better over time. It sucks day 1, and by month 4, it's not that terrible anymore as your panic reduction speed will have greatly increased. Is it worth it for 2 points? Probably not, but it is viable. Short-sighted reduces your foraging radius by a flat -2, but you can mostly counter it by wearing glasses. The glasses do have a small percentage foraging radius debuff, but it's well worth wearing them, making this a very easy pick unless you are specifically focusing on maxing foraging with as few points spent as possible. Slow Reader is another easy pick in single player. You only have to read the books once, and you can fast forward through it to avoid wasting your real life time. You might miss some perfect min-max timing with the life and living shows, but any of the 2-point positive traits are worth more than enough to justify taking this one. Weak stomach. Just take it and never eat bad food. The thing about food illness is that the opposite trait doesn't 100% protect you from death. So even if you take Iron Gut, eating bad food risks your life. Meaning gameplay wise, it's identical to taking weak stomach, as you will always need lemongrass on hand to avoid death. Take the 3 trait points and ignore Iron Gut. Agoraphobic and Claustrophobic. While the initial struggle between these 2 traits will be safely sleeping with Claustrophobic, once you learn the places where you can sleep, or acquire the items to reduce your panic, it becomes much more manageable than Agoraphobic. The problem with Agoraphobic is that it's safer to fight zombies outside, and that's where you will be facing the debuff of being panicked. Both of these traits become easier and easier to deal with as time goes on because of the panic reduction increase. Did you know Claustrophobic has a positive effect? You generate boredom anytime you are inside, which is removed by being panicked. Being bored increases your depression, which has an action speed penalty that you should try to avoid. In my opinion, Claustrophobic is the easier trait to manage of the 2. If you are willing to do a bit of research on where you can safely sleep on day 1, if you do not find panic reducing items, it becomes completely worthwhile. Conspicuous. This is a pretty controversial trait, but it's mostly because the black box that is Zomboid mechanics has misled players in the way stealth works. You read the tooltip, and it's a 100% increased chance to be spotted by zombies. But it's nowhere near as bad as it sounds. Visual stealth in Zomboid pretty much doesn't exist. Once you enter their vision range, which Conspicuous does not change, you are almost instantly spotted. The chance to be spotted is so high that with the max reduction of level 10 sneak and the inconspicuous trait, you are still spotted within a second on average. For example, if you only have a 1% chance to be spotted, but it checks 100 times a second, then you will on average be spotted in a second. This makes Conspicuous effectively free trait points. There's no World of Warcraft rogue stealth here. Just realism. Disorganized. This trait kinda sucks, but it's only for 2 reasons. In multiplayer, this trait will leave you throwing items on the ground constantly, because all of the other players who didn't take it will fill containers past your capacity. Then in single player, the backpack and car are your primary looting mechanisms, and it's a massive hit to both, particularly the backpack, as you will be forced into playing with the first tier of Overweight much more often. If you're willing to work around it and play in single player, it's not a terrible choice, but there are better options you should pick first. Hard of hearing. Not only does this trait make many sounds in the game much quieter, but I believe it visually reduces the vision radius around your character without actually changing it. Either way, it means you need to have fast reactions and good planning or risk a surprise zombie bite from behind. It's not worth the 4 points unless you're looking at some serious min-maxing or increasing the difficulty for yourself. That being said, it's not impossible to play around. I wouldn't recommend it for sprinters, but it's totally playable against fast ramblers. It might even be a good learning experience for those looking to get better at the game quickly. Hearty Appetite. This is mostly an annoying trait to take. 50% increased hunger isn't the end of the world. Hunger and your weight are not actually connected. Whether you gain or lose weight is based on the amount of calories you eat. The hunger moodle is your normal eat every 10 minutes or face the consequences that all survival games seem to have. What this trait will do is force you into spending a lot of time managing your food intake. I recommend avoiding it unless you like farming. With the change to how many calories you burn while walking, this might be a good trait for those who struggle to maintain their weight, if only because it forces you to eat more often, which might help out if you keep forgetting to check your weight loss situation. Pacifist is mostly a time waster trait. The reduced experience gained with weapons includes your maintenance and aiming skill. You'll end up breaking more weapons and spinning more repair materials because your weapon skill and maintenance skill are tied to durability usage. If you had just one more level in your weapon, you might have been able to take on that horde that killed you, or maybe that katana might have lasted long enough. You never know. I try to avoid this trait because there's no way to play around it. A ton of people combo it with Fast Learner to mostly counteract the downside while still gaining the benefit of Fast Learner for the non-combat skills. I'd rather take a different negative trait and gain the full benefit of Fast Learner. Prone to Illness does 2 things. It makes it easier to catch a cold and reduces how long it takes the zombie infection to kill you. If you combo this trait with Outdoorsman, you end up with 2 positive trait points and still a significant reduction to catching a cold. Once you catch the zombie infection, you're gonna die anyway. It rarely matters how long it takes. Some even view that as a benefit because you find out if that scratch is gonna kill you or not faster. A must-have trait in my opinion. Sleepyhead. Don't take this. You get tired faster and there's an entire feedback loop around getting tired that will kill you. I've explained it in a previous video, but getting tired reduces your stamina regen rate, which makes fighting much harder and requires more planning. Also, both fatigue and exertion reduce your foraging radius. This will limit your maximum foraging radius to very early in the day. Smoker. If you don't smoke, you become anxious, which ends up being a damage and foraging debuff. With normal loot rarity, this is not that much of an issue besides wasting a bit of your time, making sure you keep smokes and a few lighters around. Driving around to the various gas stations will net you thousands of cigarettes in apocalypse mode, for example, so it's never really a concern. Once you start getting into multiplayer or making loot rarer, it turns into nightmare fuel. You cannot lose this trait in the vanilla game, which means it's a permanent debuff the moment you run out of cigs, and you will be wasting lots of time looking for more. Zombies do drop cigs and lighters, so it is infinite, but entirely reliant on RNG and spending your time forever looting zombies. Whether you take this trait or not depends on your settings and how long you plan on living. It does have one bonus. When you smoke, you lose all of your anxiety, which can help out a ton with the other sources of anxiety in the game. Unlucky kinda sucks, but I view it more as a difficulty slider. It's a negative 10% chance of all loot spawning, and negative 5% for your chance to repair an item. The repairs don't matter, but the loot reduction does. It is more obvious with the very common items, as they take much larger percentage hits than something that was already rare in the first place. But 10% is 10% after all. Do you want the game to be more difficult? Take it. If not, don't. This trait is removed in multiplayer because it doesn't work there. Asthmatic is absolutely terrible. Stamina is your lifeblood in this game, and double usage when running and increased swing usage is the worst thing possible to choose. You can play around this, but it's permanent, and even taking 10 fitness to make up for it only brings you up to a normal 5 fitness character when running, and you'll want to use the lightest weapons possible or end up flailing uselessly. I'd question taking this trait even if it gave double the points. Fear of blood. This trait makes you panic when doing first aid on yourself, unable to do first aid on others, and you gain anxiety once you hit a threshold of being bloody. If you want to be a doctor in multiplayer, don't accidentally take this trait. Otherwise, you can play around this trait. It takes a ton of managing cleaning your clothes and body, but washing machines and multiple sets of clothes help out. Shooting at a distance avoids getting you bloody, but all that melee sets off your anxiety like mad. Definitely a time waster, and if you aren't set up, a water waster. Feeble reduces your strength by 2. This isn't as bad as it sounds. The worst part is the reduced carry weight. The lower damage and reduced chance to push a zombie over isn't that big of a deal when you can get massive damage boosts in other ways. Between sacrificing strength and fitness, strength is much easier to level. The higher your fitness skill, the faster you do exercises. Around 8 fitness and up, you can smash out a full set of push-ups in 10 game minutes. Strength also levels while walking with over half your carry weight and every time you hit a zombie. I'd take this trait if I wanted something I could recover from fairly easily. High thirst doubles your thirst rate. It is very crippling if you can't secure a water source or containers to carry it with. Once you have 2 bottles and a source of water, it becomes a non-issue aside from the permanent hit to your carry weight that carrying an extra water bottle brings. Securing water isn't normally an issue in the vanilla game, since you can drink tainted water directly from the source without fear of dying. That means puddles, rivers, and ponds are fair game as long as you only do it once and wait for the sickness to fade. When you start upping the difficulty through custom settings and mods, this trait can get very punishing. I still avoid it when I can, but it's no issue to take. Out of shape. This is Feeble, but for fitness. You gain 1 fitness experience every time you hit a zombie, and the lower your fitness, the slower you exercise. This means having lower fitness is the worst combo. Unlike strength, fitness levels make a much larger difference on your character. Endurance regen speed, fatigue generation speed, attack speed, and running endurance usage. It directly counters the fatigue feedback loop while also giving you a buff to combat. Fitness is life. I'd avoid this trait unless you are looking for difficulty or min-maxing. Overweight makes you start 10 pounds overweight. That's kilos, right? You're 10 units overweight and you can only lose 1 a day. This gives you 11 days of minimizing your calorie intake to lose the debuffs. Speaking of the debuffs, the important ones are the -1 to fitness and 30% reduction to endurance regen. There's also the part where you can't take the positive trait athletic, which is a huge loss in my opinion. The rest of the debuffs do matter, but you can play around those. You can't play around the reduced fitness and endurance regen. You'll have to rest on chairs frequently. Remember, you can't fast forward in vanilla multiplayer. If the server you're playing on is running the default 1-hour days, that is 10 hours you have to wait to lose this negative trait. This trait is not a get out of jail free card when it comes to keeping yourself fed. You still have to eat due to the hunger moodle. You still have to figure out how to acquire around 3,000 calories a day as soon as your weight hits normal. Fishing is your friend, even if you're starting at 0 skill. I see a lot of people saying it's the best one to use just because it gives you more time before you starve to death. That's going from 35 to 45 real life hours before you starve to death. If you can't figure out how to feed yourself in 35 hours, you're never going to. You can cut that number in half for single player and fast forwarding, but it's still a very long time. Overweight is nice when entering an already picked lean server, but it's no excuse to try dunking on underweight. You're only pointing out your own inability to figure out fishing, trapping, foraging, or farming. That's the order I would focus on them, by the way. Next is Restless Sleeper. Only take Restless Sleeper if you're looking for difficulty. It is truly not worth the points otherwise. Here's how fatigue works in the game. It's a 0 to 100 scale. You start at 0, and when you hit 60, you get the drowsy moodle. That's basically the end of your day. Your stamina regen decreases in line with the amount of fatigue you have. Restless Sleeper makes your character wake up after a handful of hours sleeping or at 30% fatigue. 30% fatigue is half your day gone. Luckily, good quality beds give you between a 10 and 12% boost when you wake up. Average quality gives no bonus, and bad quality gives a negative bonus. If you are forced to sleep in a chair or the floor with Restless Sleeper, you are going to wake up minutes from being drowsy again. This makes Restless Sleeper one of the worst traits for custom harder difficulties, and still a terrible trait for normal difficulty. You're always playing with 1/3 of your day missing. Unless you plan on eating fatigue removing food every single day, you will be permanently worse at fighting due to the fatigue feedback loop. There's no way to play around this without the fatigue reducing food. Even if you combine Restless Sleeper with Wakeful to return to a normal amount of sleeping hours per day, you are still facing the reduced endurance regen. You will have to rest more often than a normal character, and that makes it bad for combat. It turns out, Slow Healer doesn't slow down your healing. Instead, it makes the wounds you take worse. For example, if you take a scratch with a healing time of 10, you end up with a scratch of healing time 13. Same end goal, but different way to do it. In a game where a single scratch can kill you, this is simply free points. If you're playing on some other difficulty, such as bites only or no infection, this loses its power and ultimately hinders you. Arm wounds are a nightmare, and longer lasting ones will make you go crazy. Speaking of Slow Healer, only the scariest type of wound, a broken bone, can be healed faster by having a higher first aid level when you put the splint on. Hope you get lucky and it's on a splintable limb and not your skull. Slow learner is a straight time waste. Everything but fitness and strength gets a negative 30% experience gain multiplier. I guess there's a bit of difficulty to it, as you do end up using more resources to gain the same amount of skill levels. It's bad. Don't do it unless you are min-maxing. Underweight, underweight, underweight. One of my favorite negative traits. It's almost a positive trait if it didn't reduce your fitness by 1. Unlike overweight, you can take athletic, which is a major boost to your character for all the reasons I stated when talking about out of shape. I see a lot of people who are afraid of this trait because it reduces your melee damage by 20%, except that's not quite right. It's not the only debuff or buff you will be facing in the game. For example, every melee attack you make with your weapon does more damage at max range than minimum range. There's also the strength damage bonus, weapon skill damage bonus, and critical hits. There's a lot going on, and the points you get from this can easily cancel it out. It's probably less than a 10% DPS decrease when you take everything into account. Meanwhile, Overweight's endurance regen buff costs you a lot of time, which is also a DPS decrease. Unlike Overweight, you only start 5 units underweight. Since you can gain 3 pounds a day, that means a player who spawned with a stick of butter in their house can lose this negative trait before their second day ends. Even if you aren't lucky or are playing in multiplayer, it's very easy to find enough food on day 1 and lose the trait by day 5 in the worst case scenario. This reminds me of a weird community role-playing thing going on with underweight and overweight. It's fine to roleplay, but I keep seeing it pushed as the only way to play the 2 traits, and it goes a little like this. The underweight character has to run around constantly trying to find junk food to eat, and the overweight character has to stay at home, read books, and eat perishable food while waiting to lose weight. The problem with this role-playing, and some people are extremely forceful about it, is that it's the opposite of how the traits actually play out. Walking and running uses up a lot of calories. The underweight character wants to keep their calories as long as possible. This means they should focus on getting their weight gain up to the double up arrows, then chill out, read skill books, and watch Life and Living. The more they stay still, the less food they need to lose their negative trait. Even if they do want to move around, they should be eating all the perishable food they can. Most of it has very low calories, and by the time you clear and loot a house, you may have used more calories than it had in it in the form of perishable food. It's gonna go rotten anyway, feast upon it. Meanwhile, the overweight character can sit at the negative 2200 calorie cap for 10 days straight. They don't care. Walk all they want, the calorie loss means nothing, although they should avoid running with that stamina regen debuff. Sure, they can eat the perishable food to save on the non-perishable, but since they are only eating to hold off the hunger moodle, they barely need to eat at all. Go around fighting all day, and the calorie loss has no hit to their food or negative trait. The overweight character is the one who should be all over the place because it costs them nothing. Push that advantage to gather up as much loot as possible. That's it for my rant on the toxic role players. If you plan on doing anything other than grind your combat skills, I'd recommend you do not take Illiterate. It'll also prevent you from getting any of the recipes you have to read a magazine for. This makes for a very useless character when it comes to multiplayer, as everyone else can specialize while you really can't. Even then, it's a lot of points. Worthwhile for someone focusing on combat. Thin-skinned is another one of the negative traits that looks terrible, but when you dig into it, it really isn't that bad. The key factor here is exactly what is being changed by that debuff. Someone made a decent deep dive on it for the Project Zomboid subreddit, but the gist of it is that it's a small percentage of a small number. The real downside to the negative trait is that trees will absolutely shred you if and when you decide to run through them. In my opinion, it's mandatory to run Outdoorsman with this trait, as it'll tone down the razor blade filled trees and give you a significant resistance to catching a cold. The general community response to the trait is don't get hit, which I think is fairly good. Practice risk-free gameplay and you'll live much longer. After all, any hit can end your run. Obese and very underweight. To be honest, both of these traits are awful, but very underweight barely comes out as worse. Unlike underweight, it does significantly reduce your stamina regen, and the 40% melee damage reduction combos off of it to make one of the worst combat-based characters. The only redeeming value is that for both of these you will be trash that wants to avoid combat, which means fishing in a zombie-free area is free game for a very underweight character to quickly gain weight, while the obese character is locked into a set amount of suffering. Obese is much more flexible for different custom difficulties, so don't discount it entirely. That being said, you can lose these traits, so they are good for the ultimate min-maxing builds. Just like the other heavily punishing traits, Unfit is really only there for those who seek difficulty or min-maxing. Fitness is one of the slowest traits to level, only slower than Nimble. It's also got some of the best bonuses, so missing out on it is pure suffering. Sure, you can level your fitness, but there's nothing worse than exercising for a week in game and then immediately dying when you finally go out looting. Also with low fitness, you exercise even slower, so it takes much longer than you would expect while wasting even more calories to exercise. Weak, on the other hand, is an interesting option. Unlike fitness, strength is relatively easy to level, and it gains experience passively while walking as long as you are over 50% of your carry weight. If you take the points from this trait and put them into fitness for the increased exercising speed, you can slam out a few hundred experience a day in less than 30 seconds. Or focus heavily on it to gain 2 or 3 levels quickly if you find pain relievers so you can sleep through the exercise fatigue. Definitely a growth style negative trait, but man are the first days of barely being able to carry anything sucky. At least you can still fill up cars and bags for your looting sprees. Organized comes in handy for this. Deaf is the ultimate difficulty button. Not being able to hear the zombies at all is straight masochistic. You should try it out sometime. With that, I've covered all of the negative traits. I find these way more interesting than the positive traits, as the positive traits lack anything particularly mechanically interesting. I do enjoy managing the panic traits and the kind of inherent immersion they bring you when you are playing them. That's it for me today. Farewell.